Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Agni, or heat, separated from his mouth, and all the directors of material affairs entered into it in their respective positions. By that energy, the living entity expresses himself in words. Purport. The mouth of the gigantic universal form of the Lord is the source of the speaking power. The director of the fire element is the controlling deity, or the Adidaiva. The speeches delivered are Adhyatma or bodily functions, and the subject matter of the speeches is material productions, or the Adibhuta principle. I'll just keep on reading, because this is actually too esoteric for me to understand it. Unless someone understands, then they can explain it. Okay, we'll keep on reading. Even in this third canto for some time now, I think. This part of the third canto is quite a challenge to give class in. In fact, Prabhupada never gave class on this. 13. When the palette of the gigantic form was separately manifested, Varuna, the director of air and the planetary systems, entered therein, and thus the living entity has the facility to taste everything with his tongue. When the Lord's two nostrils apparently manifested themselves, the dual Ashwini Kumaras entered them in their proper positions. And because of this, the living entities can smell the aromas of everything. Thereafter, the two eyes of the gigantic form of the Lord were separately manifested. The sun, the director of light, entered them with a partial representation of eyesight. Thus, the living entities can have vision of forms. When there was a manifestation of skin separated from the gigantic form, Anila, the deity directing the wind, entered with partial touch. And thus, the living entity can realize tactile knowledge. When the ears of the gigantic form became manifested, all the controlling deities of the directions entered into them with a hearing principle, by which all living entities hear and take advantage of sound. Purport. The ear is the most important instrument in the body of the living entity. Sound is the most important medium for carrying the message of distance and unknown things. The perfection of all sound or knowledge enters through the ear and makes one's life perfect. The entire Vedic system of knowledge is received by oral reception only, and the sound is the most important source of knowledge. Namo Vishnu Vidaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Namane Namaste Saraswatunde Gauravani Bacharane Nirvishesha Shrunivadi Paskyatyade Satarane. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, Sarvapani Padam Tat Sarvata Shri Shramukam Sarvata Shrudimalokam Sarva Avriti Tishtite. That everywhere his eyes and nose and faces, his hands and legs, his eyes and faces, and this way the super soul exists everywhere, pervading everything. So in one sense, due to our mistaken perception, we think we're doing everything. Did you ever hear that before? I'm sure you have. Prakrite kriyamana ni gunai karmani sarvashaha ahankara vimudama kartaham iti magnite. The living entity, prakrite kriyamana ni, the living entity, under the spell of the material nature, thinks himself to be the doer of the activities, who are actually carried out by the three modes of material nature. In other words, we're doing something because we're a soul, we're conscious, and we have the capacity to desire. Unlike everything else that we're seeing around us, such as the floor, or the ceiling, or this table, it has no consciousness, and therefore has no ability to desire anything. But our symptom of life is the fact that we're conscious, we have the capacity to desire. Now, under the spell of false ego, we think that our desire is sufficient for things to come about. We think that there's a direct relationship between our desire and our activities. But actually there are other factors, as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita. Interesting enough, he uses the word daivam. Adishtanam tata karta, karnam cha pritag vidam, vivitas cha pritag chesta, daivam chaivatma panchama. There are actually 5 factors in the accomplishment of every kind of work. So this is actually very important for us to understand it, although it may be contrary to what we're perceiving due to our illusory state of existence, our consciousness. Therefore, we don't really take this into account for most of the time, but at least during class we can take it into account. Then we may walk out and we forget it, but at least we can spend a couple of minutes seeing reality before we get back to our illusion again. So the first thing Krishna says, adishtanam, which we're all aware of, namely this body. And adishtana means the place of action. So, generally speaking, our place of activities for most conditioned souls is in his body, the gross and subtle body. But then it's not only the body, because there are many dead bodies that don't do anything. So the body itself is not sufficient for accomplishment in any kind of work. Adishtanam tata karta, and then there's the karta. Karta means the doer. So Krishna identifies in this particular verse as the soul, as the doer. Now we may think that Krishna has changed his mind. Maybe he thought he made a mistake in the 13th chapter when he said that the soul is not doing it, he's under the spell of the modes of material nature. The soul thinks himself to be the doer. But now he's saying the soul is the doer. So which is it? Are we the doer or not the doer? So then we have to look at the 13th chapter where Krishna says, Prakrite kriyamanani. So the material nature he identifies as the doer. Kriya means to do. Prakrite kriyama gunai karmani sarvasha. And then he mentions the modes of nature, which Krishna will later mention in the 18th chapter in this particular verse also. Prakrite kriyama gunai karmani sarvasha. So everything is being done by the body, material nature, in different ways, according to the gunas that we're under. Gunai karmani ahankara. But due to our false ego, ahankara vimudatma kartaham iti manyate. The soul thinks himself the karta, but actually Krishna is saying the only doer, because the soul is identified as a doer later on in this verse I recited from the 18th chapter. So there's no real contradiction. It's just that due to the false ego, we think ourselves to be the only doer, as we don't take into account the other factors like the body that we have, the super soul, the adishtanam, the senses we have. Because you can have a body and you can be in the body and you can desire, but if your senses are defective, it's going to influence what we can do. Like for instance, if you break both legs, it's very hard to walk unless you have crutches or something. So it's not only having a body and desiring, is also you have to have the proper senses, or else it's difficult. If you have no arms and legs, then it's very hard to do very much. And those are also considered the senses. They're considered the working senses. What to speak if you were blind, deaf, dumb, etc. It would be very difficult to do very much. So, adishtanam tata karta karnam cha pritag. Karnam means the senses. Karnam vidam chesta. Chesta means when the soul comes in contact with the material nature due to the false ego, there's a relation between the soul's desiring and his false ego before activities come into being. In other words, without a false ego, we wouldn't desire material things. We'd desire spiritual things, and then we'd be under the control of a different energy called Daivi Prakriti. But because we have a false ego, and we identify with ourselves with material things, therefore we wind up in the category of doing material activities. And then there's Daivi. Now Krishna, well, the translation is ultimately the super soul. but actually the super soul has its instruments also, as explained in the 7th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. Kamaistai ridigyana prapadyante nidevata tam tam niyamam astaya prakriti niyataksoya. Those who are deluded by material desires, they worship the demigods. Kamaistai ridigyana. Ridigyana means their knowledge has been stolen. Rita means a thief. It's stolen by illusion. They worship various demigods to fulfill desires. In other words, again, we're talking about desire. The soul has a capacity to desire, but when his intelligence is taken away and he's under the spell of the false ego, then his desire is directed to his daivi. Daivi means the demigods, daiva. But the daiva, he doesn't see the super soul. And therefore his activity is material. On the other hand, Krishna says, Yo yam 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 tanum bhakta shradyachatum ichati tasyam tasyatram sharam tamaiva vidadanaha. I am in everyone's heart as a super soul, and I make the arrangements between the soul and the demigod to fulfill his desire. In other words, there are always 5 factors in the accomplishment of any kind of work. But when the soul accepts the false ego, then instead of appealing to the super soul for his activities, taking direction from the super soul, he takes direction from the super soul's representative in the form of the demigods, and therefore activities come into being. But the conditioned soul doesn't do anything independently. Either the super soul makes the arrangements through the internal energy, or the demigods make the arrangements through the external energy. But the demigods are also under the control of the material nature, mainly under Krishna's control ultimately. So there's always a higher power even over the demigods, namely the gunas, which Krishna is controlling. So when it's talking about the demigods having these powers and therefore offering them to us, this is what it's talking about, that unless the demigods were empowered to control speech, we couldn't talk. So we don't do anything independently of the demigods, and the demigods don't do anything independently of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So ultimately we're all dependent upon Krishna, but when we don't recognize it, then we just become under the control of the modes of nature through the demigods. Of course, Krishna is controlling the whole thing, but the only thing we get from it is illusion, that we're doing it. So again, there are 5 factors in the accomplishment of any kind of work, namely the body. Well, that's pretty obvious to us. We didn't create the body. It's not that we were in the womb of the body, and our mother, and Krishna, my mother was supplying us. Here's the nose. Where do you want to fit it in? We were there, and we weren't doing. We were probably desiring to get out of the place as soon as possible, but as far as manufacturing the body, we weren't doing anything. We weren't even eating. It was all being supplied to us and being manufactured by the material nature. So we didn't create the body. The mother didn't create the body. The mother is not, doesn't take 9 months and put together like a rector set, a body that she got in the mail. She puts it together and then the body comes out after 9 months. No, the mother doesn't even know what's going on. It's being manufactured by the material nature. And similarly, the father didn't figure out, which exactly child he wanted. It was all arrangement in the material nature. So Adishtanam is actually the body was supplied by material nature. The soul is ourselves. We were put into material nature because of our karma. And we were supplied a particular type of senses. As Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, which for me is an interesting verse because it tells us that most of the things we think are going on, including all our scientific knowledge that we think we have, is all, as Prabhupada keeps on saying again and again, and most of us just ignore it because it's not socially unacceptable. Most of what we think is knowledge is actually ignorance. So Krishna says, Ukramantam stitim vapi Punja, actually, the verse before that. Sharira yad avatnoti yat chapyi kramatishaha grihi vaitani samyati vayorganda avashayat. That the living entity in this material world carries its different conceptions of life from one body to another, just like the air is carrying aroma, and thus he takes one kind of body and again quits it to take another. In other words, all we're really doing is desiring, although we take a credit for a lot of things, but this is due to our ignorance. All we're doing is desiring. If we desire to serve Krishna properly through his representatives, then the result is we get out of the material entanglement. That's the only prize we're going to get. We become Krishna conscious, which is more than just getting out of the material entanglement. Krishna actually sees that we're desirous to join him again with his associates on the spiritual platform. So he reveals himself when we desire like that, in proportion to our desire. Or else, if we desire according to the modes of nature, then we receive a particular type of body. Now we ourselves are always the same, just like air is always the same. But when air passes through roses, then it smells very sweet. And when the same air passes through garbage, then it smells very foul. Now the air is the same, it's just by association. Sometimes it appears to be good, and sometimes bad, and sometimes a combination. So the soul, due to its desires, as Krishna is making the arrangement to go from one body to another, sometimes more exalted body, and sometimes a less exalted body. In any case, the soul is always the same. But Shrotram Chakshus Sparshanam Cha Rasanam Graham Eva Cha Adishtanam Tata Karta Karanam Cha start all over again. Shrotram Chakshus Sparshanam Cha Rasanam Graham Eva Cha Adishtanam Tata Manakchaiva Karanam. I got the last one wrong. Time out due to forgetfulness. So this is 13th chapter, no, 15th chapter. There is a super soul, he keeps on reminding all of us, including me. 15th chapter. And this is text number 9. Vishayan upasevate. Srotram chakshus sparshanam cha rasanam graham eva cha adishtanamana chaiva vishayan upasevate. It's all right, we'll just keep it here. That the living entity, when he gets a body, he gets a certain type of body. Every living entity gets a certain type of body. Shrotram, namely hearing. There's some kind of hearing. Even the trees, believe it or not, I guess you should believe it because it says in the Bhagavatam, that even the trees have a type of hearing. Now, even the trees probably talk to each other, but it's on a level that we probably don't understand, because it's all on a vibrational level. And they don't really need a whole lot of big vocabulary. Because what they're talking about is quite simple, it's probably pretty simple. You got an extra water underneath your root or something. They don't have to get into a whole psychological, I'm a tree. I feel so sad. So even the trees have a type of hearing by vibration. Chakshus sparshanam. Sparshanam actually means hearing. Chakshus means to see. So the trees are actually seeing, believe it or not. But what they're seeing is quite simple, like they've done experiments with plants, for instance. And the plants will actually grow around barriers. So in one sense they're seeing the barrier and they're avoiding it. But it's a very elementary type of vision. Chakshus, Shrotram, hearing, Chakshus, sparshnam. And then, of course, we can accept the trees have a kind of touch. So all living entities, even the amoeba, even up to the demigods, they all have a particular body and they all have a particular set of senses. And it's all grouped around the mind, and thus they're enjoying a particular set of sense objects. So that's in the material world. Ukramantam sitim vapi bhunjana vagunambita vimudanana pashanti jnana chakshusha. The foolish, they can understand how the living entity quits his body, or what kind of body he enjoys under the spell of material nature. For those whose eyes are trained with knowledge can see all this clearly. In other words, we're confused in material life, in conditioned life. We think with this body, we think this body, our whatever situation we're in is practically eternal, and therefore we're making all kinds of arrangements in order to satisfy our desires, material desires, which are under the false ego, demanding that we maintain this body, make it comfortable, protect it, etc., as the only purpose of life. That there's nothing more important, there's no greater necessity of life than to fulfill the desires that are arising in relation to this body. So therefore we come under the control of ahankara, of false ego. And we don't give any credit to either Krishna and even the demigods. Now, as it says, Devarsha bhutatma rinam pritrinam ekinkro yat charajan charajan saratmaryak sharanam charajan that Devarsha bhutatma rinam pritrinam, that Deva Rishi, the demigods, the Rishis, Deva Rishi, etc., etc., Pitrinam, Devarsha Bhutatma. Bhutatma means the ordinary living entities. Devarsha Bhutatma. Pitri means our forefathers. So generally speaking, the conditioned soul is completely oblivious to what he's actually obliged to, who he owes something to, who we should appreciate, at least give some recognition, some appreciation to. In the modern society, we've just cut out everyone. And those who are completely arrogant, they claim that they're the only doer, that they deserve credit for everything they do. And without getting credit, they feel that they've been unfairly treated. They've been neglected. Although they're neglecting giving credit to everyone else, from the devas to the rishis to the ordinary living entities like the animals, etc., etc. We think the cow owes it to us to give us milk. It owes it to us. The whole world owes us something. The demigods owe it to give us sunlight. The rishis owed it to us to give us knowledge. We think we deserve everything, and we don't have to do anything in return because we're so worthy. We're God, everything centers around us. That's the only reason why the sun comes up in the morning, if it does come up, to shine on us. So this is called vimudatma, a fool. We don't know how we got this. We think the body just appeared because I wanted it to appear. We don't know how it appeared, and we don't care. Modern society doesn't care where it came from. They accept the scientists, it came out of nothing. So why should I owe anything to nothing? And it just evolved mechanically into a monkey, and then it came into a human being. So why should I owe anything? To who? To what? There's nothing to owe anything to. It's just coming out of nothing anyhow. So sure, I pay my dues to nothing all the time, with nothing. That's what nothing deserves, is nothing. But the Vedic culture has a different vision. It didn't come out of nothing. It was created by God through His representatives. And they also had desires, just like we have desires, and they had better desires than we do. And if we don't recognize them, then we stay on the lower desire. We believe in Darwin and Freud and all kinds of other foolish people. And that's who we worship. We go to university and we worship these persons. We pay our dues to the university to educate us in nonsense. And then when they give us a degree and we think we're educated. And therefore we become more and more ungrateful to all other living entities, including the demigods mentioned here. And ultimately the demigods, if we offer them respect and worship, they're supposed to pass it on to Vishnu, because Om Tad Vishnu Param Param. That every mantra chanted to the demigods begins with Om, which means we're actually not offering it to the demigods. We're actually telling the demigods, I'm not really capable of, I can't check my desires, I don't know what's to be done, but I know that you're there, and I owe you something, so I'm going to worship you. But please pass it on to Om, whoever Om is, Vishnu. It's ultimately Vishnu. So every Vedic mantra begins with Om, because it recognizes that ultimately the demigods are not the providers, it's ultimately Vishnu who decides what we get and what we don't get. But in any case, there's some offering to the demigods also, because they're representatives. And the demigods are supposed to pass it on to Vishnu. That's how they get their reward also. They don't get it by, just like when Indra decided he was the controller without Vishnu, then he got into difficulty. So as long as the demigods recognize Krishna as the controller, and they pass everything on to him, then they get their reward also. So we may wonder, how is it that, by just throwing something into the fire sacrifice and chanting the demigod's name, the smoke goes up, and that's their reward? It seems like a pretty poor reward, getting the smoke. No, their reward is when they pass everything on to Vishnu. Then Vishnu supplies, through his mechanism, the heavenly planets and everything else that goes on. There's a whole arrangement, ultimately through the material nature, that everyone gets their reward if they're, as much as they're connected to Krishna. In any case, when we hear about this, we should, in one sense it's esoteric, as I said before, because I don't know exactly everything that's going on there, but in any case, we should understand that the idea that the demigods actually have a part in what we're doing is reality. And that ultimately behind the demigods is the Supreme Lord, because they're also depending on Him. So this is giving us some idea of dependency upon us, the higher forces for whatever we're doing, but ultimately the dependency upon Krishna. And if we recognize Krishna, and even if we're in ignorance, which undoubtedly to some extent we are, still if we recognize Krishna, then the demigods and everyone else will be happy with us, even if we don't bother trying to worship each one of the demigods separately. They'll get their reward anyhow if we serve Krishna. They'll be happier than if we serve them independently. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
So Maharaj, earlier you said about these senses that we have, that for example, if you don't have legs or arms, or this...
Those are the working centers.
The working senses, yes. So I just remembered one, there is one song that from one band I used to like when I was younger, about one war veteran invalid, no? He was injured in war, he was a total invalid. They cut off his arms and legs because it was everything got, he stepped on a bomb or something happened, yeah. So he was basically living on on the machine, no?
Yeah.
And so he was deaf and blind, as you said, deaf and blind, and without, he was just practically living like a plant or vegetable. So then he was conscious about his condition, He could not, the doctors did not see like if he was conscious or not. And then later he remembered that his father taught him a Morse code. And he was actually, the doctors later, somebody who knew the Morse code, later he was in that condition for a long time. They thought he was in coma or something, but that was keeping him alive for some reason. Experiments or something, I don't know. And then actually they realized that the Morse code, he's giving us a Morse code, so what he's saying, and the Morse code is in numbers. How many times you tap or give some like tap, so that's a letter, yeah. So he was saying like SOS, kill me. He didn't want to live. It was like no sense of living because you cannot. You know somebody is there. No, so like so many miserable conditions of life there is. No, we are helpless in these conditions of life, like this. And he was praying to God that like please let them hear me, like just kill me. The Morse code he was sending is SOS, kill me. Like just kill me, like
yeah.
So it was, I don't know what I wanted to really ask, but I remember this. I want to think about that. I mean, we are so happy to have these bodies, to have this opportunity to hear, to see, to learn. So I just remember that.
Good. Anything else? Okay. Thank you. Wala. Gurindra Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Gaur Bhimanande.